is the Minister for International Cooperation in Egypt. She's made time in her extremely busy schedule to join us. And we are going to actually have to wrap up at 1:50 because of another engagement right afterwards. So this will be conducted. This is a public lecture. It is on the record. We will have a moderated conversation with the minister, and then we will leave time at the end for questions from the audience for anyone who wants. All right. Thank you so much. Now, we're going to kick straight off. Mr. Marshall, thank you so much for joining us. Now, I know that you're here at the moment for a whole litany of things, but figuring prominently, one assumes, are going to be Egypt and the region's SDG roles and COP. So we're going to kick off with a question that comes up a lot. Like many countries in the region, Egypt is worried about its development. Egypt wants to increase its development. That development comes at a cost. How is Egypt going to balance the development that it needs with the sustainability that it so desperately needs?
Well, first, it's a pleasure to be at the Middle East Institute, not the first time. Many webinars during COVID and also during UNGA Week in New York. I think before talking about Egypt specifically, let's look at the global backdrop. We're here for the annual meetings at the IMF and the World Bank, and it's a very tricky global situation. We have food issues, food security issues globally. We have energy prices, which are quite unfavorable for emerging and developing countries. We have the cost of financing and access to finance for many countries becoming more difficult on the back of tightening by developed economies to be able to balance the inflation surge that is coming up. And this all is happening at the same time when countries were trying to recover from COVID. So there is a very difficult global backdrop that is not just affecting developing and emerging economies, but also the developed world. If you take a look at the IMF and the World Bank global projections, everything has been revised downwards. The recession that is expected for 2023 is going to create more pressure for capital flows, more pressure for jobs. And this is the mood that is in Washington this week. Now, what is going to be extremely important for different countries is to try to distinguish their stories. And one key topic that comes up repetitively, and you know, it's an important objective. It's an important you know, requires collective action, and that's climate action. And one of the key messages, and we just had a G24 meeting now with the managing director of the IMF and the president of the World Bank, and we said that there could be an opportunity to use climate action as a way to avail the required financing that countries would need in order to do their development. And let me be a little bit more clear. From Copenhagen and from the Paris discussions on climate, there's $100 billion that had been pledged from the developed world to the developing economies to be able to help them in their climate action. When we take a look at how much of these commitments have made their way to countries, we're falling short. And many of, or most, this $100 billion is concessional. So there's no better time now where countries require and need both to develop, both to try and overcome the very dire challenges that we're seeing globally, and integrate climate and development together. So this COP, which is coming up next month in Sharm el-Sheikh, and I'm sure we'll be seeing many of you next month in Egypt, one of the key points is climate and development come hand in hand. And one of our key messages for COP is to go from pledges to implementation. So countries that are ready with projects that are able to create the jobs, that are able to address the green transition or the climate action, and at the same time have a development aspect in nature, all of these are going to be extremely good options for this concessional finance to make their way there. And let me just conclude by saying that when we're talking about development, when we're talking about climate, it's not just public money and multilateral development banks and concessionality, it's also the private sector. However, private sector, to be able to come into countries today, they require de-risking, and that's why concessional finance is key. And this is the call from different countries during the annual meetings here. It's a call from all negotiators during different COP meetings, including in Glasgow, including what's coming up in Sharm el-Sheikh as well. So I think it's an opportune moment to try and translate these pledges into implementation so that different countries can actually weather the very difficult global situation and move forward on both their development plans as well as climate action.
Right. So thank you. That raises a really, really important point. Implementation. Now, you mentioned that pledges have been made, but people are coming up short. But here's the thing, the current geopolitical situation is going to make it easier for those countries who are worried about stepping up for their financial obligations. You're going to, the Russian war, essentially what's nearing up to a global recession, it is going to make it easier for countries to backtrack. As host of COP27, it's sort of Egypt's role to attempt to try and herd these people. How are you going to, what attempts are going to be made? How is anyone going to be able to tell countries, everyone's weathering the same issues, the climate is not going to wait, you need to step up? How is that, what incentives are there?
So two issues, there are generality and then being more granular. And one important outcome from the war this spring has been the importance of investments in food systems, in agriculture, and this is what is known in the COP world as adaptation projects. So this concept that most climate finance has been going to mitigation, to reducing carbon emissions that we can measure, has been a phenomenon which is taking place. If you take a look at this, the difference between financing that goes to renewables, to electricity, etc., there's a bias. Less goes to agriculture, to water, and these are important projects that affect many people. And so a dollar that is spent in an agricultural project in one of the countries in Africa, the multiplier impact on growth, on people, etc., is quite sizable. So one of the outcomes of what we've seen happen globally is the importance of agriculture, the importance of food security systems, not just for the developing economies, but for all countries. So this has stepped up the concept of adaptation and resilience. And therefore, part of climate finance needs to go to adaptation and resilience. And this is one of the calls of COP27. The other, and this is very much linked to loss and damage. So when you look again, this is a little bit of a COP and climate jargon, but loss and damage has been extremely important because, part of the concessionality, part of the grant element that needs to go to the developing world is in loss and damage, and that is related to agriculture, to food, and to water. So when you say, how do you push countries in that direction? Again, there's a very important case to show that countries have investable projects. One of the excuses was that there are these pledges, but there aren't projects that meet the pledges. So what the Egyptian presidency through COP27 has tried to do is to create a pipeline of projects from different countries, different regions, and say these are available. And hence, if you really want to be able to show commitments and pledges going into implementation, here's a menu. That's number one. Egypt specifically and this is an effort that we have done as Ministry of International Cooperation, is launch a country platform for a group of projects that are a subset of our 2050 climate strategy. And they include adaptation and mitigation, food, water, energy. And this is called the Nexus of Water, Food, and Energy. So it's Egypt's country platform for the Nexus of Water, Food, and Energy. And if you take the first letters of that, NWFE, in Arabic, that's pronounced Nuwafi, and Nuwafi means fulfilling promises. So what we're trying to say is, if countries are able to showcase projects which reduce emissions, affect the population, address SDGs, have climate objectives, but are developmental in nature, here we are. These projects will have to be done anyway. They add to our national goals, but they also add to the global goals. So during COP, we're going from general to granular, and that is extremely important. The other, it's not going to be an easy task for sure, given what's happening globally, but there are several initiatives that the Egyptian presidency is putting together. And on the first 2 days of the high-level leaders meeting, for the first time, there's a roundtable on water security. So this is extremely important. There's also a roundtable on, as I mentioned, adaptation and agriculture and so forth. So again, trying to push in some of the topics which really affect the emerging economies, if you will. So this is an opportunity. We're trying to use the opportunity to push these messages. Let me just conclude by one thing. The energy situation in Europe also creates an opportunity, particularly for the continent, very rich when it comes to wind and sun. And therefore, there is that aspect of investments in renewable energy to be able to avail more gas exports to Europe and so forth. So that is again a very important aspect that we are also trying to showcase at COP. In the Egypt context, green hydrogen is coming up. And in order to produce green hydrogen, you need renewable energy. We had started that in 2014, and we are continuing this, as I mentioned, through our 2050 country climate strategy and other initiatives.
So thank you. Let me just pick up on something that you mentioned a few sentences back. It's essentially about resource allocation. You're talking about financing. Many of the countries that need climate financing the most are the ones in the worst position to try and get financing. Many of these countries are rated B or below. I think a phrase that you'd used before was just financing. Africa, for example, you mentioned agriculture. Africa is getting significantly less access to fertilizer than anyone else, which means that it's producing less food. There's a whole chain. So what is being done to attempt to get past the obvious? The obvious criteria is, this is your platform for financing, this is what you need, so on. Right, many of these countries are not going to hit that criteria. What do we do?
Okay, let me give you one statistic, because when you look at the climate finance landscape, there is disparity by region, and there is disparity by sector. Most of the climate finance has gone to the developed world. And for example, if we look at Africa, per year to meet the NDCs, we need $250 billion. What has reached the continent is 19 billion. Okay, that's 250 per year. So if you are asking countries to have nationally determined contributions and translate their projects so that they meet these NDCs, that requires financing. We're falling short on that. Okay, so what do we do? As I mentioned, public money, multilateral development banks do not have enough. MDBs, like the World Bank and the likes, if we get all their money together, they only represent 4% of the required climate finance. The gap has to be filled in by private sector. Okay, so private sector needs to come to these countries. But as you mentioned, countries that need the financing the most are rated B and below. And that rating is not getting better, particularly with the global backdrop that we talked about. So here comes a few ideas and a few concepts: innovative finance, blended finance. So in order to entice the private sector to come to countries, you need to de-risk their investments. And that's why MDB money, concessional money, becomes very, very important. Another important player in the finance landscape are philanthropy. If we're talking about the Rockefellers, Amazon, etc., they're coming in with grant components that can help, again, de-risk private sector money. And what we are trying to do in the different deliberations and in the different meetings that we, and the different initiatives that are happening globally, by the way, New York and Washington and UK, there are so many initiatives, but there's more convergence on these ideas, and that's a good thing. So if you take a look at Glasgow, one of the key outcomes was GFANZ, the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, where you had a group of 450 investment banks and financial institutions pledge that they would go into countries and avail financing, but they wanted the projects. But for that to happen, the blended element needs to come in. So we're trying to operationalize all of these trillions. So the 100 billion, even though they have not been met, from Glasgow, we went from billions to trillions. What we want to do is to go from these trillions to billions, to be able to have it in the pipeline. So one of the key solutions is blending private money. Another important initiative, and you hear this at the IMF discussions and the World Bank discussions, is to think about debt swaps for nature, or debt swaps for climate action. So how can you, when two countries bilaterally discuss the debt commitment, we can actually convert that into projects, again, that go back to your very first question, that have development and climate hand in hand. So this crisis has pushed institutions, countries, policymakers, philanthropists, private sector to think about ways to be able to translate these pledges into action, and to use the opportunity, as I mentioned, of the possibility of renewables in certain countries, the urgency of reducing carbon use in some countries. So there is that momentum, and we want to be able to build on that momentum despite all the challenges that do exist.
So thank you. I'm going to come back to a lot of this in a bit, but one of the questions that came up when you were speaking was, it can be difficult to convince the private sector to put down money if they're not going to see a return on investment. So which sectors do you think are most likely to attract private sector funding? And are they sectors that the environment, that Africa and that other emerging economies are in a position to be able to offer?
So private sector is always looking for opportunities, and for that return on investment, you need to reduce the risk of finance, and that's where the blending comes in, blending of the private money with the concessional. So you're somewhere in the middle. And what you're seeing in the landscape of private sector investments is there's a displacement from Ukraine and Europe looking for other places. So the idea is countries need to be ready to invite this capital that's looking to find and relocate and so forth. And some of the important sectors, as I mentioned, renewable is extremely important, and it's extremely there is a return from that. There is also a carbon credit market that is emerging, and there is opportunity there for investing in projects and having the outcomes, and it's things are evolving. I'm not trying to be too optimistic, but if we are very pessimistic, we won't get anywhere. So we have to find solutions, and we have to be talking to each other, and this is where sometimes why are people meeting so much in annual meetings and spring meetings and this and that? Because we come out with possibilities by identifying what the problem is. I think the identification is important, and with if I look at our thinking about climate before COP26 and where we are today, I think there has been more convergence on at least the importance of different stakeholders coming together. Financing is becoming more announced, even though this 100 billion has always been there. But today it's like, how can we find innovative ways to make sure that that money comes in with private sector engagement? So I think this has all been quite positive. But again, the challenges will always be there, and we have to work around it.
So you mentioned different stakeholders. I think one of the issues in Glasgow, one of the issues that people are worried about in Sharm el-Sheikh, is that not all stakeholders are going to be able to get a place at the table. Specifically speaking, that the private sector will be at the table, the governments will be at the table, but civil society is, which includes indigenous peoples of lands, have been doing it, that it's going to be difficult for them to get a place at the table.
So let me talk about stakeholders in two ways. First, stakeholders in terms of the climate finance. And here we're also putting together the Sharm el-Sheikh guidebook for just financing. And there we are, it's work that's done with many partners, MDBs and private sector and philanthropy and think tanks and so forth. And it's supposed to be an operational guide on what each stakeholder needs to do to ensure that we are able to move from pledges to implementation. And this is going to be launched during Finance Day, which is November 9th in Sharm el-Sheikh. When it comes to everyone at the table with COP, there are rules that guide UNFCCC meetings. So everyone is there. At Glasgow, we had indigenous civil society, we had those from the islands, we had a day on gender. So there are rules that govern participation at any COP. And this is what's going to happen. This is what happened at COP26. It will happen at COP27. It will happen in COP28 and COP29. So this is not the last COP. There are going to be many to come. And in each one of them, the rules that govern the UN conference are always respected.
All right. So with that, you've used the word just financing a lot, which brings us back to something else that you mentioned, loss and damage. So to its credit, Egypt has managed to put loss and damage front and center in this discussion. Foreign Minister Shukri, as president of COP, has spoken extensively about climate justice, in that much of the emerging world is not responsible for much pollution, but is bearing the costs anyway. However, developed nations, as yet, pretty much have refused to discuss loss of damage. I think the only country that has mentioned actual money has been Denmark, and that was a few weeks ago. How is the discussion about loss and damage, which is an urgent one, going to be pushed to the forefront and on the table if the countries that need to put down money don't want to discuss it? And we'll get on to water in a bit. But just to,
Okay, so just for COP World, and yes. Glasgow was the first COP I attended. And my knowledge of climate has accelerated since then. But there's, in any COP, there's a negotiating track, and then there's everyone else.
Yes.
We belong in the everyone else track.
Okay.
And the negotiating track is where the countries sit down and they have to, fight over this text and how much money is going to be put in, yes. and how much, and in the negotiating track, there's a lot of reliance on institutions such as the OECD to be able to do the accounting of what has come from here, what is what is calculated as this and that. So on the negotiating track, loss and damage is there. Egypt during COP27 will have an initiative on that. And it's good you mentioned Denmark. The environment envoy of Denmark, who used to be the head of the biggest NGO about climate action, is joining or is one of the advocates of the Loss and Damage Initiative, along with the minister from Chile. So both of them are pushing for this initiative on trying to, and as I mentioned, the war that's happening, the importance of food and food systems globally has made the realization of the need for investments in adaptation, investments in agriculture, making sure that loss and damage is accounted for even more pronounced. So that is something that's taking place during COP27.
Thank you. The other thing that you mentioned, which I found interesting, was water. Because, and I know that there's a specific day for water, and again, good job that made it onto the list, because countries have been specifically reluctant to discuss water. Do you think that, what is Egypt looking to, as host, what is Egypt looking to get out of the discussion?
Again, the many countries have deficits in water, and we were just discussing this yesterday on the opening of a food symposium with head of USAID, and she was saying, like, there are some areas in the world that have a lot of water and flooding, and some areas that have very little water.
Yes.
So and this is the outcome again of climate change and all the industrialization that happened in one part of the world and affecting other parts. But the water or deprivation of certain areas of water require investment, whether it's water treatment plants or water desalination in other places. And these are all development projects and climate projects. So to be able to avail the financing for such is again very, very important. So in discussions related to water, it's not forgetting that food requires water, not forgetting that SDG number 6 includes water, and therefore it's a global goal that was agreed to in 2015. So all of this and the discrepancy with respect to water resources brings up the urgency of discussing it. And this is the first time that there's a dedicated roundtable on the first 2 days, which has the political leaders to sit down and see, what is it that we can do to ensure that food systems, which require water, and the discrepancy, as I mentioned, in terms of water supply, are taken care of.
Thank you. I'm very conscious that we need to leave some space for questions from the audience. But
I thought I answered everything, but anyways.
Oh, audience, so we'll see. Let me just jump back because this is, in general. Let me just jump back specifically to Egypt. So as Minister for International Cooperation, what are you looking for? We'll get to COP in a bit, but you're here at the meetings. What are you looking for specifically for Egypt at the moment? And this is
so let me also maybe explain what Ministry of International Cooperation does, because it's not very typical in countries. We are the designated ministry that negotiates on behalf of the Egyptian government with all institutions, bilateral and multilateral, with the exception of the IMF. Okay, so the IMF is with the central bank and with the Ministry of Finance, but all other financial institutions, World Bank, African Development, European Investment Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, USAID, the German Development Fund, etc. So what is this? What does that mean? And where do we stand? You started your question by development. Development or official development assistance, ODA, concessional finance, is meant to support countries in long-term projects that are developmental in nature and affect people. These concessional financing does not only go to the government, but it also goes to the private sector in order to implement different projects. Egypt's portfolio with all these institutions, current portfolio, is $26 billion across projects related to water treatment, social housing, renewable energy, wind farms, etc. So our role has been to try and secure cheap financing, concessional financing, development financing that supports Egypt's development agenda with the international community. So this is a partnership. And why is this particularly important? It's important because this type of financing is earmarked to projects so that you can see the results. Number two, there are so many countries competing for such financing. And when you are able to avail it, it means that you are consistent with procurement, with governance, with international standards of environment, etc., in being able to negotiate these deals. So this is what we do. I give you an example. 2020 and 2021 were very difficult years when it comes to financing. There was COVID. There was a rush on markets and so forth. We were able to secure cheap financing or concessional financing in those 2 years of $20 billion, $5 billion to the private sector. So this is the role we play. Here at the World Bank meetings, and this is with other institutions, we're also responsible for the strategies that we put with these institutions. What is Egypt doing with the World Bank over the next 5 years? What is Egypt doing with the African Development Bank over the next 5 years? And what is very important in this discussion is that your strategy is always country-led. However, countries need to have national goals which are consistent with the global goals. Everybody was there in 2015, agreed to 17 SDGs. In any project we do, we try to map the SDGs that are being fulfilled. The beneficiaries in terms of the people who benefit are also identified. And maybe for those who are interested, on our website, we have done an official development finance mapping to the SDGs. So you can go to every SDG and see exactly where on the map of Egypt is there a project, what is this project about, who's the development partner that is working with us on it, and how many people benefited and so forth. And this is, again, a tool which we avail to basically show that development finance is able to achieve, or is a way to achieve, the SDGs, and is a way to achieve development in the country. And when any country is doing its development policy, it's also adding to global development goals.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask whether there are questions, because I can keep going, but I'd just like to see whether there are questions from the audience. You really are covering ground. Sorry, did you? Yes, please. And if you could just sort of identify yourself, that would be, thank you.
Hisham Fahmi with the American Chamber of Commerce in Egypt. There is a controversy about oil and gas at COP. But there is also agreement that you cannot change from oil and gas to renewables. There must be a transition here. Can you comment on that, please?
So the African countries particularly have asked that gas be considered a transition fuel in the interim. And I also would like to guide everyone to a communique which came out on September 9th from Cairo. We had the Egypt International Cooperation Forum and the African Ministers of Finance, Economy, and Environment meeting. And they came out with a communique, which is actually their ask from the global community come COP. And it was the launch pad for Finance Day, which is November 9th. So in that communique, you would find exactly, an item on that. What is it that nations want with respect to this transition period? And also on the financing, and also on, as I mentioned, the debt swaps and so forth. So there is a very serious discussion about that, and it's reflected in this communique.
Thank you. So I have a couple of questions. I know that your time is short, but I have just a couple of questions. One of them being on food security, which you mentioned at the beginning. I think if the fallout from the pandemic and the fallout from the Russian-Ukraine war showed anything, it is that food security in many countries, even countries that you wouldn't normally, is significantly more delicate and fraught than most people think. What's being done to ensure that countries don't just fall off the edge when it comes to famine due to things like this?
Yes, the global numbers are quite scary.
Yep.
With what's happening both from the pandemic and from the war, you have an additional 250 million people, pushed again to poverty. So many of the hard-won gains over the years are being washed out, unfortunately. Let me speak about the Egypt case. We are one of the biggest importers of wheat.
Yeah.
However, a few years ago, and this was 2014, one of the first things the president did was to invest in silos, wheat silos. So you would think that the country that's the biggest importer would already have storage space for it. We did not. And silos, for those who haven't visited silos, please do, because when I visited a silo, I didn't know what it was. They look very like cement structures, but there's so much IT when it comes to the quality of the crop and making sure there's no pests and so forth. So anyway, so it's a development project. That's what I was trying to allude to. So we invested in silos, so we were able to store wheat. The other thing that Egypt did between 2014 and now is to increase the arable land for wheat production. So we actually consume half of what we consume, we produce locally. So when the crisis hit, there was preemptive action, if you will, that helped us mitigate the implication. I remember when I was here during the spring meetings in April, it was just a month after the war, and there was a state of panic in each and every international newspaper. Egypt, the biggest importer of wheat, things are going to go X, Y, and Z. It was there was a mood of panic abroad, and internally things were fine. And I came and said, yes, there's a difference between panic and shock. So it's very, very important for countries to continue reforming all the time. So if we hadn't invested in silos in 2014, it would have been a very difficult situation today. If we had not invested in more land for wheat and giving incentives to farmers to cultivate wheat, it would have been a very difficult situation today. So each country has its very, country-specific modalities. However, what we have learned is that you keep on reforming as much as possible to be able to weather whatever shock happens, and the world is not short of shocks, unfortunately.
No. And again, conscious of your time, my last question. Before my last question, are there any questions? Please.
Thank you. Andrew Deutz from the Nature Conservancy. So we've been the organization that's brokered the last 3 major debt swaps in Seychelles, Belize, and Barbados. And I just want to say thank you to Egypt for showing some leadership on bringing this financial mechanism to the fore. The leaders' declaration that came out in Cairo, I think, was a huge step forward. And I would just encourage you, and I know there's a big opportunity now at the COP to advance this agenda. Now, we have a large pipeline of countries who want to do these deals. We have a large number of investors, both investment banks who can do the brokering and asset managers who have the money, who's willing to come into the ESG space or come into the emerging market space. The limit on our ability to scale these deals is the credit enhancement from the public institutions. So I would just encourage you to encourage them to be much more forward thinking in how they leverage their own balance sheets and to think about how to scale these up, because I think it's a way we've done a back of the envelope calculation. There's about $2 trillion in addressable debt that could be substantially reduced to create more fiscal space while also accelerating policy implementation around NDCs. So just thank you for your leadership, and please keep pressing this at the COP.
Thank you for that. And let me say something Egypt specific and then I respond to your question. So we have debt swaps with Italy and Germany. We have a debt swap with Italy, a program that started in 2001 and continues. Of course, in 2001, the climate rhetoric was not there. But when you do an analysis of the projects that benefited from the debt swap, there's energy efficiency, there's water, there's communities in protectorate areas and so forth. one very important fact is that a debt swap has a creditor and a debtor. So it's not done in a multilateral system, right? You have to have the two parties sitting together and agreeing to doing a debt swap. However, the multilateral system can provide options of bundling once the two parties agree. And that's the discussion that's taking place. How can we make sure that there's public money or MDB money that can leverage or increase or maximize the debt swap that's happening between the debtor and the creditor? And a serious discussion that's taking place is how can we create KPIs or identify the projects or the outcomes of the project so that you're convincing the public money that's coming in or the private sector that wants to participate. As you mentioned, there's so much money there, or at least we hear these big numbers, but we want to see them coming. So there is that is happening, and in our country platform, the NWEFI platform that I mentioned, we are also discussing so that we also exemplify how we can push it forward. But I think given the debt distress globally today, everybody's going to be pushed anyway in that space. And it's good that this discussion has happened and is happening so that the tools or the toolkit be ready once the decision is taken. But again, debt swaps, two parties have to come, negotiate, and agree. And I can tell you that's not very easy. But nonetheless, let's create the convincing or the supporting environment by having this toolkit. So it's thank you for following, and we are continuing to push.
Thank you so much. All right. Final question in 2 minutes. I have to go. There was a fair amount of, I think, disappointment and discontent after Glasgow, which is to be expected, I suppose. What is Egypt going to consider a success for COP? I mean, what is it that you would like to come away with and feel, okay, that won't work?
Yeah. I think and again, the COP agenda is on the website. So I invite everybody to take a look at the thematic days. There's a youth day, a gender day, an adaptation day, a finance day, and so forth. And I think that the initiatives that the COP presidency has put forward, having those passed with all partners, any initiative it's not a country initiative, it's a global initiative, right? So you have the stakeholders, you have the MDBs and the private sector and so forth. So I think these initiatives being passed with consensus is going to be extremely important. A discussion such as the debt swaps we just had, a discussion on definition of just financing, a discussion on what do we mean from pledges to implementation, more country platforms to be showcased. I think all of these are important. But one fact, there is no COP which is going to be conclusive, because there has to be a COP 28, there has to be a COP 29. We're in that business for some time. So whether this COP is a failure or this COP is a success, I feel that from every conference there have been positive outcomes. There have been positive outcomes out of Glasgow. There will be positive outcomes out of COP 27. There will be positive outcomes out of COP 28 and so forth. So let's see what is the positive. Try and push that forward, and try and minimize the differences of opinion. And I think sometimes some items within the crises might be pushing us in that direction.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Minister Marshall, thank you so much for coming. Thank you to everyone. Time went really fast. Thank you to everyone. And I would just like to mention that MEI is going to be at COP. We have a panel on adaptation. So if anyone's going to Thank you.